New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos. You can now download a free PDF copy or purchase a beautiful printed edition of Issue 5 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. The great German poet Goethe once suggested that we can never understand the full depth of who we are unless we realize and can grasp the scope of human history. Yet few people have had the boldness or the vision to recognize patterns in the multiple events of our history. One such person is with us today, Riane Eisler, author of The Chalice and the Blade, a book which is having a revolutionary impact on our culture. The great anthropologist Ashley Montagu has described this book, as have many critics, as comparable in its import to Darwin's Origin of Species. An attorney, an evolutionary scholar, a futurist, and co-director of the Center for Partnership Studies in Pacific Grove, California, Riane Eisler is truly a Renaissance woman. Welcome, Riane.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You began asking questions about human nature, essentially, because of your experiences during World War II. You began looking at why people seem so cruel to each other. Let's start there.
Well, you know, I think that today we are beginning to understand that the so-called scientific objectivity is in many ways something that is a figment of people's imagination. That yes, we must look at things from a perspective that is analytical, but that the kind of work that we choose to do, and even the kind of subjects that we choose to look at, really are very deeply rooted in our own life experiences. And certainly mine is such a case. I was a refugee child. My parents and I had to flee for our lives from Hitler's Europe. And so very early I really did have to ask myself questions that for me never have been academic. Questions like, do we really have to live this way? Do we have to hunt and persecute each other? Do we have to have all of this violence, this warfare, and also all of this tension, which of course, you know, this war of the sexes, which my work shows that war and the war of the sexes are inextricably interrelated. So these questions really were there for me. And in the 10-year study from which The Chalice and the Blade derives, I really did set out using an interdisciplinary approach to deal with some of these questions. But there was also something else that made it possible for me to do this. And I think we were talking about, you know, things that people consider given. Very early, when I was very young, I changed. First of all, I was born in Vienna. Then we fled to Havana. In fact, we were on the last ship before a ship that some people are very well acquainted with. It was the St. Louis. And there was a movie made about it, which was called Voyage of the Damned. And it was a ship that was turned back to Nazi Europe so that the people died. So, you know, I mean, that was quite an impact on my life. But I really, what I wanted to say is that going from Vienna to Cuba and then to the United States, I learned very early that the things that people consider given, just the way things are, that they're not the same everywhere. And that too was very, very important.
You have made a career, in effect, out of challenging a dogma that many people assume, it 'twas ever thus. People have always been inhumane to each other. Many scholars would say you can look as far back as ancient Egypt and you see they built the pyramids on slave labor. And I think you've made a revolutionary claim when you suggest, well, we are capable of looking back even further than ancient Egypt and discovering that there was a time when we, in effect, lived in a Garden of Eden in peace and harmony with each other.
Well, you know, I was telling you a little bit about this 10-year study from which the chalice and the blade derives, and I think that one of the things that distinguishes my work from most other studies that are really concerned about these vital problems in our world today, are we going to make it in this age of nuclear possibility of nuclear war and so forth, that the study takes into account the whole of our history, including our prehistory. And most important, perhaps, it takes into account a database that includes the whole of humanity, both its female and its male half. And this really leads me to a very important thing. When we just look at part of a picture, we of course don't see the whole picture, but we also get a very distorted view. And a lot of the models for studying history have been very distorted. And one of these models, in terms of looking at our history and at prehistory in particular, was, for example, that prehistory is the story of man the hunter and man the warrior. And in order to have that approach, a lot of data that was there all the time was simply distorted, manipulated in some way, as we tend to do, to make it fit into our world view. So I think that what this book has done and what this study has done is to really it's like putting together the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, some of which are new, because there's been what British archaeologist James Maillard calls a veritable archaeological revolution. But some of them were there all the time, but we weren't able to see them because we had to keep making them fit, into the old view. And the story that we've been told, because we live by stories, we humans, we really do. We live by stories and we live by images. And the story that we've been told, be it the story of original sin or the story of selfish genes, both of which, not coincidentally, also go along with stories about the inevitability of male dominance. That story is designed to maintain what I've called a dominator rather than a partnership model of society. And I think it's not coincidental that in our time, when the dominator model, when the blade is the nuclear bomb, when one more war could be our last, because at a certain level of technological development, the dominator model literally goes into self-destruct. I don't think it's accidental that we are now reclaiming for ourselves this archaeological data and being able to reconstruct a different story. And this really is what, in many ways, my work has been about, is to tell a story that is certainly more interesting, much more congruent with the best available scientific evidence, and yes, a more hopeful story about that most extraordinary of all adventures, which is, of course, our human adventure here on Earth.
I think even as we rationalize it, we have the 18th century model of Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, that man is a beast, and we form a social contract. We build a civilization for the purpose of protecting ourselves from our own bestial nature.
You see, what we're finding out, and of course many people throughout the ages have really known this, even through the 5,000 years of what I call the Dominator detour of recorded history. We've known that we human beings have many choices. I mean, what distinguishes us from other animals basically is the tremendous flexibility that we have. So we can't talk about human nature in an abstract sense. We have to talk about human nature in the context of one of these two models of society. And yes, in the dominator model, what is constantly being reinforced, what we're constantly almost forced to be, is to bring out, this aggressive and cruel and dominator part of the picture. But we also know that we have the possibility, look, we're the only species that has this really articulated quest for beauty and for knowledge and for justice. We also have a tremendous capacity for those things. And as a matter of fact, look, the picture that's now emerging is so fascinating, because what we're beginning to find out, you mentioned some of these earlier legends, and they've been clues, and the clues have been there all the time. What archaeology is now verifying is that these legends are actually based on fact. They got distorted along the way. And as a matter of fact, because what came later was so tense and so awful and so brutal, they looked back on them as paradise, as something ideal. They were not ideal societies. But what we're now finding out is that the original direction in the mainstream of our cultural evolution was in this less tense, in this more natural direction that I've called the partnership rather than the dominator model. And the good news is that what's happening today, so much of what's happening in our world today is not new or radical. You know, the women's movement, the peace movement, the international ecology movement, all the movements for social and economic and racial justice, but they're really part of another partnership resurgence, reconnecting us with these very early cultural roots.
In other words, most of us who have been educated to believe that human history goes back 3, 4, 5,000 years, and that's all there is, are sort of lost in that history. Perhaps in the distant future, people will view this phase of our history as a brief aberration.
Well, you know, I think that, as I said, there's been a revolution in archaeology. And one of the things that we're finding out, see, the way that they used to date things was sort of funny. If something was fairly advanced, say it was found in the Balkans, they said, well, it must have been a Greek colony, about 600 BC. Well, now comes along Willard Libby with radiocarbon dating. He got the Nobel Prize for that. And we're finding out that instead of 600 BC, it was about 6,000 BC. So that's the first thing. But even more important, because archaeology is a much more scientific discipline. You know, it isn't just this sort of grave robbing thing of looking for treasures for the big museums, the way it started in the 19th century to a very large extent. But it's really an interdisciplinary science to try to reconstruct how, and really much more systematic, from the remains of houses, from the way people buried, from, you know, their dead, and of course from the art, which is tremendously important, how people viewed the world and how they lived in it. And what we're finding out is tremendously exciting, because what we're finding out is not only that civilization is much older than was previously believed, that there wasn't just this one cradle of civilization in Sumer, you know, about 3200 BC, but that there were many cradles of civilization, all of them thousands of years earlier, and that these cradles of civilization were structured very differently from the way that we've been told civilization always has been, and then by implication always must be structured.
Let's go back to the time of the agricultural revolution, which I think would take us back to the early Neolithic period, 8 to 10,000 years ago.
Right.
That, I think Alvin Toffler, the futurist, calls it the first great revolution in human history.
Well, you see, most of the work that's been done, and I think that Toffler certainly has done, you know, some very interesting work, has focused only on what I call the technological phase changes. But they have not focused on another principle, which is, I think, even more important in many ways, which is the tension, both through prehistory and history, between these two possible choices for us, the partnership model and the dominator model. If we look at the Neolithic, not only as a great technological revolution, but also in terms of a technological revolution in a time where in the heartland, you know, where agriculture could flourish, where, you know, the earth was a good mother to us, and because these people worshipped a great goddess, Mother Earth. They had what we today call an ecological consciousness, okay? Because they really literally revered, you know, the life-giving powers of the earth. But if we look at these societies from the perspective that this was a tremendous technological revolution that took place in the context of a partnership rather than a dominator model of society, a lot of things become much more interesting and much more clear. Because what we then see is that unlike what we've been told in our schools, that even we're told two contradictory stories, you know, but they both have the same point, that something better is impossible. You know, one is that it's innate, this mess, and the other one is that with civilization comes warfare, slavery, and male dominance. That's what we're still taught in many universities. We're finding out that that's absolutely not factually based, that as a matter of fact, for thousands of years in the Neolithic, there were societies that were peaceful, that were not male dominant, that really were structured very, very differently. And that's really the excitement about the findings of places like Çatalhöyük, which is where James Maillard is the largest Neolithic site ever found.
That's in Turkey.
In Turkey. The excitement of the work of UCLA archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, who has been excavating a whole civilization that was previously unsuspected, which she calls the civilization of old Europe, centering in the Balkans and in Greece. You know, that what was previously classified as Greek colonies, you know, 600 BC is now 6,000 BC, and it's an indigenous, partnership-oriented civilization that, as I said, where the powers that govern the universe were not imaged the way that we've been taught to image them, as a male god holding either a thunderbolt, like Zeus, or a sword. A thunderbolt is both Zeus and Jehovah. And Zeus, of course, has both a sword and a thunderbolt. In other words, power over, power to conquer, power to destroy, power to dominate. But as a great mother, what was being worshipped is the power to sustain, to nourish, and also to illuminate and to enhance life. And it was a completely different ideological system that went along with a completely different way of living in this earth.
In other words, it's as if the feminine power is viewed as the power of creation, the power of giving life, and the masculine power is more the power of taking life, of destroying.
But that is only a construct of the Dominator society, and I really want to stress this time and time again. When I speak, I just make this point. Clearly there were men in these earlier societies. You can't do this thing alone. I mean, they would have been extinct. We wouldn't be sitting here.
Right.
The whole idea of the schizophrenic thing, where you only have the feminine and women be the quote soft feminine values like caring and compassion and nonviolence, and then to be a real man, you've got to be hard and tough, and you've got to dominate and destroy. That's really very much a construct of the Dominator society. And of course now we're seeing a lot of reversal of that. Look, we live in a time when women and men are asking the most fundamental questions. We're asking, what does it really mean to be a woman? What does it really mean to be a man? This is truly revolutionary to ask these questions, and it is part of the urgency of accelerating this contemporary shift from the Dominator to the partnership society. And many men, for example, today are doing fathering in the way that is stereotypically considered mothering, isn't it? In the gentler, more intimate way. So we're getting away from all of this. But I mean, whatever we get out of this, this is not an issue of women against men or men against women. It's an issue of how we structure society, beginning with the most fundamental of all social relations, which is the relation between the two halves of humanity. That's women and men.
So in the Neolithic period, the dominant image of a deity, of a god form, was the image of the Earth Mother, and thousands of these statuettes.
Thousands and thousands. And talk about bizarre interpretations of information, because of course these were unearthed already in the 19th century. And there are these oval-shaped figures, and the way that they were interpreted by some of these archaeologists was, and I quote, ungenerated products of the male erotic imagination. They thought they were sort of ancient counterparts of Playboy centerfolds. And then they couldn't figure out why these people had such strange standards of female beauty, because, they were large-hipped, the sacred parts, the life-giving parts were emphasized. So yes, but I want to make a point here, and again, it goes to what we were talking about earlier. Yes, the dawn of human consciousness. You see this tremendous miracle. Life emerges from the body of woman. So you image the powers that govern the universe as a great mother, from whose womb all of life ensues, to whose womb all of life returns at death, like the cycles of vegetation to again be reborn. But if you look even at some of the later mythology, you see that this great creatrix, the life-giving force, Gaia, if you will, in Western civilization, she had both divine daughters and divine sons. In Egypt, we see Isis, she had a divine son, Horus. In Greece, we see Demeter, she had a divine daughter, Kore or Persephone. This is very important, because what it tells us is that these were not matriarchies. These were societies where both women and men were honored and revered. And one of the contributions of, I think, the chalice and the blade, and of the work that I and many other people now are joining in, is to disabuse us of this 19th century idea. Because when this data was beginning to emerge in the 19th century, a lot of the scholars of the day did this weird thing. They said, well, if these were not societies where men dominated women, they must have been. They must have been societies where women dominated men.
And they called them matriarchies.
Right. And then when the data didn't bear that out, a lot of them heaved a big sigh of relief, and they said, oh, well, it was patriarchy after all. Well, of course, the alternative to patriarchy is not matriarchy. That's just the other side of a dominator coin. The alternative is what I've called a partnership model of society. We're beginning with the most fundamental difference in our species, which is the difference between female and male, without which we just couldn't go on. That difference is not equated with inferiority or superiority. And that is really the model that's appropriate for the pluralistic society that we hear so much talk about today.
And this partnership society in which the Mother Earth was revered and nature was revered seems to have been found all over the world in Neolithic cultures.
Yes, now my work has focused primarily on Western civilization because that's most of the early archaeologists were Westerners, and you know, the ethnocentrism, that's where they did most of the digs. But there is now data emerging that all the primary agricultural centers in Southeast Asia, in the Americas, that the original thrust in the mainstream of our cultural evolution was in this more natural, more pleasant. Look, the bottom line about the partnership model, and I mean, it's more fun. It's just a more pleasant, but it's also more creative. All the basic technologies on which civilization is based were really developed in these early societies, these early partnership-oriented societies. That's what we're finding out today. And it is absolutely makes sense because in the dominator model of society, creativity has to be very tightly controlled. And it has to really be channeled. Look, I mean, the great works of art that were produced even in the Renaissance, they were commissioned by popes and by, you know, and they had to paint certain things. And it wasn't, one of the things that's so fascinating to me about art is, you know, Minoan Crete was one of the last known civilizations in Europe, orienting to the partnership model. And when we look at that art, it is so exuberant, so full of life, so celebrating of nature that scholars have been, you know, puzzling as to why. Well, I mean, the answer is that it was the last civilization, you know, orienting to this partnership model. But what we see, which is so interesting, is that it isn't until the Impressionists that you begin to see a resurgence of this freedom of expression, of this joyfulness and this love of nature. And if you look at the dolphin fresco in the Queen's apartment in the Palace of Knossos, it could be a modern ecology poster. So what I'm trying to say is that the new images that we are creating for ourselves today are tremendously important. Tremendously important. And really one of the results of the tremendous grassroots response to the Chalice and the Blade has been the formation of an organization called the Center for Partnership Studies. And one of our main goals is to put together, through participatory research, through action-oriented research, with many, many people participating, a partnership image and data bank. Because we need, we can protest against the dominator model all we want, okay? And that's what we've been doing. But the task at hand now is to create the alternative stories, the alternative images, and the alternative models, all the way from economic models to technological models to models of female and male relations. And that's what we're doing.
You know, I'm reminded of H.G. Wells writing in The Outline of History something that I've puzzled over. He said that at one time, 20,000 years ago, there were what he called heliocentric cultures all over the world that worshipped the sun and that built these huge observatories and Stonehenge and these monuments to mark the sun. It would suggest perhaps a male religious imagery that was existing in partnership with the worship of the goddess.
Well, you see, this whole idea that the earth is only female and the heavens are male are part, again, of the mythology of, look, I've got 2 chapters in the Chalice and the Blade called Reality Stood on Its Head, the whole remything process. But think for a moment, even in the Bible, where we are led to believe that there never was and never could be anything except a male deity, a father, lord, and king. There's the prophet Jeremiah, and he's railing against the Queen of Heaven.
Yes.
And the people say to him, I mean, read it in your Bible, they say to him, when our wives, because by then only the men talked, you know, the women were suppressed along with feminine values such as caring and so forth. And the men say, when our wives baked cakes for the Queen of Heaven, we lived in peace and we lived in plenty. The clue was there. Now, in terms of this dichotomy that only the male is associated with the sun, that's really absolute nonsense. She was also the queen of the whole thing. It's a cosmic vision. And they didn't make this artificial distinction we make today between nature and spirituality. And you know what we today celebrate, you know, at Christmas time, the winter solstice is, of course, the core of that. And it was the day that the ancients celebrated because it was the day that the goddess was supposed to give birth to the sun every year. And it was this great celebration of this renewal. So that's one point. The other point about Stonehenge, Stonehenge was built not 20,000 years ago, but during the Neolithic. And it was very, very clear that these were great centers, places of worship, and that it was still the old nature-centered religion, the worship of the powers that give and sustain and illuminate life. And these people had incredible knowledge of astronomy. They weren't, one thing I want to say, there's a lot of superstition stuff going around that these people were, if they existed at all, that they were all what we call right-brained. Absolute nonsense. You can't build these kinds of things without using the linear left brain, so-called left brain reasoning. Moreover, Minoan Crete, it was a highly technologically developed society, the first paved roads in Europe, the first aqueducts. It was also the society that had the first indoor plumbing. So you just, I mean, we've got to disabuse ourselves of a lot of these dichotomies.
In other words, we can have a partnership society and maintain our technological advances. We don't have to give up our technology, but rather give up the direction that we use it.
Jeffrey, this is a core point that I've made again and again in my work, that one of the problems with the dominator model of society is that by definition the emphasis has to be on technologies of destruction and domination. The problem is not technology. The same technological base can give you very, very different applications. So it is not an issue of technology. We don't have to give up. Technology is not the enemy, okay? And the whole idea of enemies anyway is part of the dominator, you know, in-group versus out-group thing. I mean, this whole thing transcends the conventional thing of capitalist versus communist. Look, Gorbachev in the Soviet Union is really trying to move, has been trying to move towards more of a partnership model. And it's not accidental that he has a partnership with Raisha, his wife. I think that if we think in systems terms, we can disabuse ourselves of a lot of this fragmentation and get down to the basics. And that's what this is all about.
It's as if what you're saying is so fundamental that we can't help sometimes but get caught up in the dominator mode of thinking, us against them, dichotomies, this and that. And what you're suggesting is something interwoven, something very holistic, really a new way of seeing everything.
Well, you see, I think that the reason that it was for me so extraordinary doing this research and why so many people have come forth after reading The Chalice and the Blade and have said, this has changed my life, this is so empowering, is because it is a way of unraveling, but it's also a way of reweaving. It doesn't just criticize and say, oh, this is bad and that is bad. It really does show in terms of patterns that all through history, as a matter of fact, there have been partnership resurgences. I have a chapter on early Christianity on this, but today this is coming to a climax.
Riane, we're out of time. It went so fast. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure being with you, Jeffrey.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 2 in the New Thinking Aloud Dialogues book series is a tribute to parapsychologist Russell Targ, celebrating his 90th birthday. New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.